as lack blurs faces and names. This rupture, brought about by the colonial episteme, erases the fuller memory or awareness of the pre-colonial. Unquote. In our case, the loss of the past involves the construction and adoption of a specific narrative of conquest and origin, and the loss of the syncretic notion of Hindustan. The nationalist narrative that this generates powers the process of partition, which over time leads to the domination of the majoritarian position in the resulting nation states. It is always a pleasure to be here at the LLF, and much more so today because of the person who is sitting next to me. Manan Ahmed Asif, together with a group of historians, is taking the writing of the history of the Indian subcontinent to a very high level. An engagement with the perception of the past through a rigorous analysis of certain texts or historical sources is a critical part of this project. This approach is rooted in the groundbreaking work of Ronaji Guha and the Subaltern Studies Collective, which includes historians like Shahid Amin, Partho Chatterjee, Dipesh Chakraborty, to name a few. Now a younger generation of historians, in which Manan is hugely prominent, is taking the effort further. The reconstruction of the world of the oppressed, a world that has no voice, is incomplete without the deconstruction of the narrative of domination itself, thereby exposing how this narrative is based on a profound and willful misreading of historical sources. Manan puts the issue facing the historian very clearly. Where there is no disciplinary recognition that something has been erased, the history of a concept must first deal with the act of political forgetting. Manan teaches history at Columbia, and at this early stage in his academic career has written two very important books to which we now turn. Let's start with the Chachnama. Regarding the Chachnama, you express your position in this way, and I quote, "The text at the heart of the Chachnama is misread, mischaracterized, and misplaced." Can you go into some detail on each of these misses?
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for such a astute and warm introduction, and thank you to the LLF and to everyone here for joining us. Chachnama is a text that enters colonial historiography around 1799, 1800. And it enters as a text that was cited by the historian that I would go on to write my second book about, Tarikh-e-Farishta. And so in Farishta's history, Farishta that is, uses Chachnama to tell the story of Islam's arrival to Sindh and Sindh's centrality to the political history of the subcontinent of Hindustan. So that reference that Farishta provides, once it enters European languages through a translation by Alexander Dow in 1768, is taken up as a project of amassment. What I mean by that is that specifically Henry Myers Eliot, who works in the kind of foreign services for the East India Company, he's someone who negotiated the transfer of power between the Sikh Empire and the East India Company here in Lahore. He's also the guy who delivered the Kohinoor to the Queen Victoria. Eliot began an amassment project where he wanted to collect all of the histories that are cited by Farishta after the rendering, the translation of Farishta into European languages by Alexander Dow in 1768, as I mentioned. One of the texts that Farishta had relied on, as I mentioned, was Chachnama. And Chachnama thus becomes acquired. The earliest manuscripts are taken up from Tata. And then Eliot begins the task of excerpting that information from the Farsi text. What I meant by it's mistranslated, misquoted, diced up, is that Chachnama tells two parallel stories. It tells the story of a kingdom based in Sindh around Lahore or Al-Ruh that is the precursor to the polity established by Muhammad bin Qasim in the early part of the 8th century. So the Chachnama as a text, it's written in the early part of the 13th century. It has these two cycles in its structurally, two cycles of a young ruler coming to power and then their fall. One is Chach, who is after whom the text becomes known colloquially as Chachnama, and the second is Muhammad bin Qasim. For the East India Company political agents who are involved in Sindh. Sindh, if you remember, falls to the East India Company in 1843. It's one of the last conquests of the company. For these political agents, the history of Islam's political conquest is extremely important. So these are people that the most famous one of them is Richard F. Burton, who you may have heard in different ways. Chachnama becomes a text for those political agents and for Eliot to tell a very specific story about Islam's arrival. What is the main part of it is that they have no interest in what happened before Islam. So they have no interest in Chach, they have no interest in any of that stuff. But they're very interested in the military conquest, and they're very interested in this idea of Oriental despotism, which is the ruling concept in Europe now for almost 100 years that determines how political structures are organized under Islam, but really specifically the Mughal rule in the subcontinent, in Hindustan. So Chachnama becomes a text that is taken up, it's excerpted, so sections are translated into English, and then it's deployed. And by deployment, I mean that the massive history writing, so one of the most popular texts of history that is written in the subcontinent by a European, is by, now I'm just going to blank out his name, so sorry, Elphinstone. And so this is a history that kind of gives you a survey of all things that have ever happened. And Chachnama becomes a very important part in this survey, and how it's deployed becomes the way in which the story of the origins of Islam, and the origins of Oriental despotism, and the origins of Muslim misrule begin to be kind of understood very, very kind of at a pedagogical level and at a level of broad conversation. And this is already by 1850. And so that's the kind of entry point of Chachnama into the European historiography.
Yeah. Once you disconnect the Chachnama from its reputation as a conquest narrative understood in the colonial sense, you describe it as a text that imagines the creation of capitals, forts, networks of roads, and houses of worship as political acts with multiple agents, Muslim and Brahmin. It argues for the basis of a polity to emerge from negotiation and dialogue, and it situates itself very consciously in an Indic milieu, from which it gathers both culture and intellectual succor. Do you think that the Arab encounter with India strengthened the need for understanding, accommodation, and even compromise with what they saw?
So I think before we can understand what we can do with a text like Chachnama, written, as I mentioned, early 13th century, taken up in the early 19th century, and deployed for a political purpose, we have to understand what reading a text even means. How do we read something and make sense of it? And especially if that something is 800 years ago, and it's a world that we don't really can grasp, not only because we are modern in the divide between the ancient and the modern in the philosophical sense, but also because our understanding of what constitutes a community is radically different. So even if a text from the 13th century says something like the Muslim, or it says something like Uch, those two things, the Muslim and Uch, or Uch Sharif, a very dusty small town at this point, but at the point of the text was a literal center, cultural center of all of Hindustan. I think as historians or even non-historians trying to make sense of the past, we do not come to grips with the alienation that we have. Alienation in the sense of how do we understand that these people, their worlds, their thoughts are accessible to us in a transparent manner. That when they say Sunni, or when they say Brahmin, or when they say Siva Salar, they mean things that we understand them to mean. That problem of alienation is compounded by 200, 250 years of commentary and analysis that the colonial state puts on top of it. So it's not simply the case that we can pick up a text and say, well, I, as a human being person, can interpret something in this text. But we struggle, all of us, as post-colonized subjects, we struggle under 200 plus years of colonial understandings of us, of our bodies, of our thoughts, but of our past. And there's no easy answer, there's no easy respite from this colonial construction. We cannot just escape it by saying that we gained independence. We haven't had a process of decolonization that allows us to figure out how to think about the past in a way that's not premeditated by colonial discourse. So you read Chachnama and it has conquest, it has the destruction of mandirs and the constructions of Jamia masjids. It has, well, only one story of conversion. It has fantastic violence that is happening. The colonial state looks at these bits of the text and says, look, here are conquering, invading Muslims. Here is the primordial, original violence that happened to the subcontinent. And that's the seed, that's the origin of everything that happens after that. My task in reading this wasn't simply to allow myself somehow magically be transported to the 13th century and figure out what Ali Kufi, who was the putative author of this text, imagined or felt or saw. I can't do any of those things. So what I relied upon as a methodology is to try to think of the text as a structure in and of itself. So you don't excerpt it, you don't translate it into concepts that are au courant, or that are in our present. And you don't allow for the understandings that colonization produces in us, that Hindus and Muslims are enemies or have civilizational differences for 1400 years, or the idea of political thought comes from Europe, that ideas of kingship come from Europe, ideas of resistance come from Europe, and are then implemented in parts of the colonized world, in the darker people, as W.E.B. Du Bois said. So my task that I, as very grateful to put the intellectual lineage, drawing upon folks like Ranajit Guha and Shahid Amin, my teacher, was to actually try and see how this text coheres in itself. What are the references that it is making? And it creates a dense relationship of interpretation. To this dense relationship of interpretation, I spent some 4 or 5 years walking around Uch and Sindh in general and talking to people. I am a product of Zia-ul-Haq's educational system. I was told that Muhammad bin Qasim was the first citizen. I was taught that this is the origin story for Pakistan. And so, as a scholar, my task was to try to understand these multiple iterative hundreds of years, colonial hundreds of years, and then post-colonial theories of interpretation of the same text. How can all of this be built on a text that when you start to read it is speaking a very different language? It's not interested in conquest at all, has no interest in thinking about difference in the way that we think about difference. And what I tried to argue in the book was that actually Chachnama is a political theory text. It's a text that says, how do we govern when we are off the margins? We're in a space that is tied to the Indian Ocean rather than has any real political relationship to what becomes the center after the Chachnama, after Iltutmish's death, Kabacha's death in Delhi. It's a world that is completely alien to us in its political sense. We can't understand that Delhi is nothing, has nothing to add to the political history of the subcontinent. That's not a concept that we are familiar with because Delhi becomes the capital of many, many, many generations of rulers. So what do we do about a text written in Uch that actually looks to the Indian Ocean, that actually tells a very different story? How do we understand that text? And that's I think, what I was trying to do.
What is quite interesting is the point you make that not only did the colonizer colonize the prose of domination, it also colonized the prose of insurgency and resistance. So everything that we were doing was in some way or another related to Metropolis. The Shahid Amin in his book on Ghazi Mian, the war, life of a warrior saint, takes got a shrine in Daraj, puts the matter quite succinctly. He says, it happened the way it is remembered. And I think that's quite important. So can you develop a little more from what you said earlier, that what is it that the Chachnama and the Tarikh-e-Farishta are trying to remember? You have told us what the colonized version is trying to remember, but what are they trying to remember? And that relates to the relationship. And I think it's not my distinction, it's Shah Ahmed's distinction between text and pretext. That there is a dynamic at play there. And the remembrance comes from that interaction, retro-poor as it may be. So just could you develop a little bit more?
I think what I would, Shahab Ahmed, who has I think a wonderful book, What is Islam, draws a lot upon Hans Gadamer's philosophical kind of underplay of how to think about method and memory and history. One of the things that I am invested in is this idea that Shahid Amin in his work, especially from his work on Chauri Chora, also his event memory metaphor book from 1995, is how to think about an event or a memory in its multiplicity, not to pick the right answer, not to assume that a truth lies, but not also to imagine in the deconstructive vein that all answers, all narratives are transparently at the same level. In other words, to hold on to, as Foucault did in his answer to Derrida, hold on to the question of power in our interpretive mode of understanding the past. And so one of the things is that a text like Chachnama and a text like Tarikh-e-Farishta are not simply texts written for us to read 800 years later. They have an idea of the future for sure. They're writing for the future. But they are doing what we are doing. They are imagining an ethical project. They are imagining a project that is embedded in an intellectual geography. These are people that Ali Kufi reads, or people that Farishta reads, other historians. They go out to the putative bazaars and they talk to people. Both of these texts make very clear that the authors are talking to the muhakkikeen or the hakims or to people who are the storytellers. And from these sources, textual sources, oral sources, from poetry, from things that we can call myth, but they are history, Mahabharat or Chachnama, the ethical task of the historian is to construct a version of the past that can serve a pedagogical or a didactic function to the political power, to the power whose responsibility it is to be ethical towards its subjects, whether or not that subject has the same religion or the language or ethnicity or race that the ruler does. Now, here in this kind of what we call the mirror for princes genre, this is a hikmat genre that Nizam al-Mulk or al-Farabi or the Alexandrian romances are all part of. This is both a way to shape the political discourse, but it's also a way, very importantly, to shape the ways in which elite think about their responsibility towards the task of governance. So when Farishta and Kufi are constructing a history of the past that they are inheritors of, they see this as a very explicit task of ethical framework, infrastructure for interpretation. So both of them make something that I think is, Shahid Amin's work on Ghazi Mia also helps us think about. What they do is they say, well, here is a version of an event that I heard. Here's a version of an event that's written in another history. Here is another version that I imagine happened. Across these three versions, and maybe more, we have to hold on to a type of hermeneutics, a type of interpretive mode that says that our task is to be a vehicle for political rule to be a force for good and just. And this is not interpretation in the sense that I'm not reading anything into the text. They are literally just looking at it and writing it out. So Kufi, for example, in Chachnama's author, Kufi, talks very specifically about another author that is in the same orbit with him, Afi. Afi has a Jawama al-Hikayat, has a kind of a traveler's tales text. Now the traveler's tales text is like, you go on a journey and then something bad happens to you. Somebody picks your pocket, you eat at the dhaba and you get dysentery, a ghost haunts you, and so on and so forth. For each of these types of calamities, Afi says, this is what you should do. So if the most familiar that you might be is sections of the Gulistan, Sadi's Gulistan, where Sadi has these adventures or misadventures. It's that genre. That genre is about just conduct. It's how do we behave as human beings when things are bad on us? We are in trouble. We don't know how to answer. And I think the historian's version of that is particularly exactly that. What happens when political rule goes bad? What happens when we don't have the answer to literally Chinggis Khan, who is coming with his hordes and is going to surround the fort? How do we answer that? We don't have manpower, we don't have, the type. So what is the politics that emerges out of calamity to which we can orient a just thought? And that's what the author of Chachnama is very clearly orienting his text towards. So as to give us a political theory for the calamity that he finds his world in. That is the Mongol calamity for him. Farishta, very similarly in the 16th century, late 16th, early 17th century, is looking at a calamity of the Portuguese and the English and the very shortly the attack on Surat. So he sees the European as a calamity that's happening. And so these are texts that are produced in a moment of extreme political instability that are answering that instability by giving a historical rendering of political thought that could guide us in order to know a better future that we can build as a political society. What's really important for us to understand is that we have imagined a world, both the present, the future, and the past, that is governed by faith or faith-based communities. And here we have historians who have their own self-proclamation, Muslim historians attached to courts that are Muslim courts, that are not embedding their political thought, their interpretive concerns in theological grounds. They're surrounded by the spaces of faith-based kind of interpretive communities, but they are very clear. They're not drawing upon that material. They are drawing upon histories, philosophies, poetry, and as I mentioned, other types of material. And again, to me, as a historian, there are very important lessons that we need to take as we undertake our own task of interpretation in the world that we live in. Some of the historians that for my Farishta book, I spent a lot of time with are historians who are writing in the last half of the last decade of 19th century, in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. People like Muhammad Habib, Zakaullah, and a host of historians. And for them, under colonial rule, the task of medieval history is to figure out a way of interpretation of that deep past in order to understand what a political reality for their present is under colonial rule. They don't all give the same answer. I want to make sure we understand that. But it's important that that's what they're responding to. And I think my task is to kind of think about how Kufi and Farishta were able to do that for their very, very particular moments in time.
Yeah. This is where you introduce the notion of spatial history, which by definition cannot be a history of Muslims or a history of Hindus. It's a history of a space. Its culture, its politics, whatever you want to say. And you also introduce the notion of intellectual geography. Now, we understand the spatial history part. Can you develop a little bit on the intellectual geography part? Because I think that's hugely important.
I mean, I think that's really important because, again, a type of monoism enters our imagination when it comes to, let's say, the history of Muslims. This is part of the colonial project. We are supposedly tied to the point of origin in Mecca or Medina. We are tied to a dynastic worldview, that's the procession of caliphs and kings. We are tied to a conflict, whether we are fighting in the Crusades or we are fighting in Panipat. That is not only ahistorical and fictive, it also occludes from our view the many, many diverse ways in which these intellectuals related to each other at the moment of which they were writing. Let me just give the example from Farishta. Farishta is in Bijapur. He's in the Hyderabad, the Deccan region. He's a diplomat. He's also a physician. He's a field physician. That is, he's a person who's on the battlefield. And he has 2 very extremely important medical texts. For Farishta, it's when he's commissioned by Ibrahim Adil Shah II that write a history that has never been written to this day. Now, when you say that, in, let's say, 1580, you're competing against Abul Fazl and Akbarnama. You're competing against Nizamuddin Ahmed's Tabaqat-e-Akbari. You know, these are not things that you can surpass. And these are not things that you can just look at and say, oh yeah, I can do better than that. You know, that doesn't happen. And it doesn't happen for Farishta. And so I think what Farishta does is which is radically important for my project, is that he says, I'm not going to tell you a history of a faith. I'm not going to tell you a history of Muslims. I'm not going to tell you a history of descent as in kings who give birth to other kings, who are usurped by other kings, and so on and so forth. He says, actually, I'm going to give you a history of a space, and this space is Hindustan. And this Hindustan stretches from Kabul to Bengal, the Himalayas to the Lanka. And he says, in this space, there are rulers, there are merchants, there are people, there are dynasties, there are faiths, and we can actually take a holistic look at all of them. And in other words, in order to one-up or surpass Akbar's, Abul Fazl's Akbarnama, he takes out the organizing principle for history writing and gives it the principle that we are very familiar with, because history, the discipline, the modern discipline of history, is embedded and entirely held hostage to the nation state and the nation state's boundaries, right? We as a historian, and I will say myself as a historian, I'm held hostage by the borders of the nation state. And so we understand that very well now. It's not a concept that Farishta is embedded in. I mean, he's part of the Bijapur kingdoms, and yes, the Mughals are in Delhi, but these borders are not understood in any kind of fixity. And so, in order to tell this history of a space, he constructs a genealogy of authors. And he says, actually, what I have to do is I have to be in conversation with everyone else who has written on this space, this Hindustan. And what he does is that he builds a citational network, and what I call in the book an intellectual geography, that goes for the length and breadth of Hindustan. Now, again, this is a radical move in history writing. We are very familiar with the idea of isnad as a type of chain of transmission that gives us a tradition. We are also very familiar with the eyewitness account, right? Which is the kind of other type of history writing. What Farishta says is that actually we can trace citational relationships between people, place, and archive. And by these citational chains, we can actually build how in the history of a particular place, Malwa, Sindh, Deccan, can be built out of the archives and the history writing that takes place in that. What this allows for Farishta to do is that it takes away the impetus for the motive for history to occur, right? So this is the kind of a classic philosophy of history issue. Why do things happen? Well, one easy answer is God. God makes things happen. All right? So the version that we as a discipline, historian as a disciplines have inherited is Hegel's version, right? Where there's a spirit, a Geist. And that Geist, as it has moved historically through space, has given the ways things happen its typology that Hegel then describes for us. And Ranajit Guha most famously turned it upside down.
So obviously, this methodological breakthrough that you talk about, or the methodological leap that Farishta executes in the Tarikh, is quite significant, isn't it? And can you sort of put it into some sort of context, a context of intellectual history? Because from what you're saying is that the history of a time or space is very close to the intellectual history of that time and space.
Yeah.
And that completely destroys the empiricist position, in my view.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about the importance of the methodological breakthrough that Farishta?
Absolutely. So let me try and do this in a comparative way for both the Chachnama and the Tarikh-e-Farishta. So two texts. One is written in the Deccan, one is written in Och. The Chachnama is written in the early part of the 13th century. Tarikh-e-Farishta is written in the early part of the 17th century. Two very different texts. Both of them are, however, doing a methodologically unique things. So for the 13th century, if you were to assemble a dossier on how to write history, you would have a model, either from the Arabic historiography, Arabic/Persian historiography, which would basically be a genealogy of prophethood. So Tabari's Tarikh is the most kind of familiar, maybe, to us. You start with Adam, Hazrat Adam, and you kind of go down. You go down that list. Now, what's important in that genealogical mode is the idea of the Jahiliyyah, right? What existed before the light of Islam? Well, darkness. What do you see in the dark? Well, not a whole lot. So we don't have to spend a whole lot of time thinking about it. So the historian who is talking about Islam, if they are to talk about pre-Islam, they would talk about it in the encounter itself. So someone like Baladari writing in the 850s in Baghdad is going to write his Futuh-e-Buldan, his text, which is kind of a compendium of various conquests. Insofar as the pre-Muslim polities come into view, they come into view when the conquest starts. Now, Kufi, when he begins to write his Chachnama, does no such thing. In fact, the vast majority of his text is a story that has nothing to do with Islam. It happens 60 to 90 years before the Prophet. Has no relationship to it. The conqueror, Muhammad bin Qasim, comes, like I said, even 70 years after that. So how do we understand this? This is a text that is fully embedded in the Jahiliyyah, as in historiographically speaking, and has the interaction don't exist. The Chach and Qasim are not protagonists against each other. So Kufi, I think methodologically, does something that is really important for that moment in the 13th century, which is what he says is that the history of Islam or Muslim society, insofar as we are to understand it in its origins, exists in an ongoing timeline, in a list of histories that predate it. So here is a person he's a refugee by his own accounts. He's a refugee who fled the Mongols in the early part of 13th century, who's writing a history of something that happened 500 years before him. All right? It's not an eyewitness account. This is not about what was happening in 13th century. He's writing about something happened 500 years before him. In the same space. Sin, yes, but 500 years before. And he shifts both of the ways in which we think about the past for him and the ways in which we think about the idea of the political, what constitutes a polity a government, a state, or any versions thereof. That's a kind of radical methodological innovation for Kufi. And the version of this that Farishta, I think, very importantly deploys, as I mentioned earlier, is again that he eschews, he doesn't organize his history by descent of kings, he doesn't give you a history of a faith-based community. What Farishta does is he takes time, universal time, and embeds it into place. So different places have different timelines. History starts at different moments. Why? Both because when those places come into being, but most critically for Farishta, is when historical writing comes into being. So history only begins when historiography begins. Again, this is very, very radical, because the idea would be that time begins even before the fall, right? So there are two historians, separated by hundreds of years, writing in a time of political calamity differently, who are imagining the task of history writing in a radically different way. And that, I think, again, is something that for us as historians, we need to understand that. What are the ways in which we can think of history itself, not as a question of origins, not as a question of a particular faith-based community, but a type of engagement and understanding of past and how to write that past, right? That part is really the key for how to understand Kufi or Farishta.
Just to put a footnote on it, I think, and do correct me if I'm wrong, that Farishta begins his history with a chapter called Hindustan Ke Aqaid, and that is a discussion of the Mahabharata. And there is also a discussion of another mythological time, and that so there is a continuous.
Yeah, absolutely. So he says, look, and this is again, I mentioned how Kufi has an entire history of Chach, a Brahmin before the history of the Muslim conquest. For Farishta, simultaneously or similarly, Mahabharata is the Mustanid Tarikh, it's the authentic history. And from the Mahabharata come these various timelines that orient different parts of Hindustan. And what he does is he kind of interpolates Mahabharata time, what I call the dharmic time, with the time, the cosmological time that we inherit from the Quran and Hadith. So this is the time of the Qasasul Anbiya, which is a genre that is very popular in the 16th century. Stories about prophets, that, it's a timeline. So we have the dharmic time, we have the kind of time of the prophets, and thirdly, Chachnama. So the time of the Sassanid understandings of kings. And so all three timelines, Farishta says, actually, we need to see how they are braided together. And this act of braiding is an act again of history writing. So when we think about this time, we don't think of them as beliefs, that I believe in Sohrab or I believe in Krishna. That's not how a historian like Farishta is operating. He's saying, look, we have to think of the historiography, the writing of history within these timelines, within these cosmologies, and how all three of them are the inheritance that he has in Bijapur, from which one can write a history of all of Hindustan. So these are, I think, important methodological frameworks, because his contemporaries, I mentioned already Abul Fazl, but Nizamuddin Ahmed, whose Tabaqat-e Akbari is very important, and then we don't have the name authored text, but Tarikh-e-Alfi, another very important history, massive, these are massive texts, even Tarikh-e-Farishta, which is very brief, which is why I decided to work on it, is 1,000 folio pages. These other texts are 5-6 times as much. And so these are not the approaches of his contemporaries or near contemporaries. These are, however, the approaches under which we can think of a political theory for this space. So when we think of the language, Dakkani, when we think of a polity like the Bijapur polity, the actual political theory is incredibly embedded. It's a braid. And I think what he does is he says, yeah, okay, I can bring this into the task of history writing itself. And in the historical traditions through which my job, Farishta's job, is to then write his own version. And I think that's where I found this incredible innovation. So, you know, the commission is to Farishta is to write something new. Naras, with a 9th flavor. And you know, he does. You know, it's one of the only successful commissions that I am aware of in my study of 1,000 years.
So, there is this version, and there is the other version, which I guess most of us are more familiar with. A few thousand years of the golden Hindu age, culminating with Ashoka and Chandragupta Maurya and all that. A few thousand years of Muslim marauding and pillaging, and then the colonial administration arrives to liberate the subject population from all this. Conscious of the time, just lastly, can you just link the conquest narrative with the loss of Hindustan?
So, I think if we just build a timeline, what we see is that as early as Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of Roman Empire, and the highlight would be something like James Mill's History of British India, father of J.S. Mill. So as early as 1776, when Decline and Fall is published, and all the way through, this tripartite understanding is the basis of periodization. The golden 5,000 years past, the Hindu past, the dark Muslim age, which really begins for the earlier generation of British scholars with Muhammad bin Qasim, but then is shifted forward to the 17 raids of Mahmud al-Ghazni and the destruction of Somnath. And then the apogee and the Nadir, Akbar and Aurangzeb, and then the liberal period of the British rule. I actually yesterday looked at the history textbook for grade 8, and it's exactly this model. So congratulations to whoever is writing this. There isn't anything we can do without breaking away from this kind of periodization. The conquest narrative is central to this periodization, because what it says is that any faith-based community's purchase into history is through this act of original violence. Now, you may want to like this original violence, as Zia did, or you may be against that original violence, as the Modi regime is now, and is orienting an entire politics around it. But that's basically the fact, that you are focused on the question of the originary violence in order to define people and history. The reason I think it's important for us to understand the loss of Hindustan, which is, I'm sorry, we haven't even talked about what that means, is that if we are, let's just keep it in the question of, if we are able to understand a history of a space or of a communities that isn't predicated on a originary violence, good or bad. Then we have to understand what this periodization is doing and what it's structurally embedded into. Now, a way in which I've tried to do in my very humble, brief work is that we can actually return to the so-called originary texts themselves. We can actually go and read what the colonial historian was reading in order to construct this model. This model does not exist anywhere else, by the way, right? It literally does not exist in any history that is written at the same time as James Mill's History of India. So Tabatabai's Sir al-Mutakhirin, commissioned by the East India Company in Calcutta, has no such model in it of history writing, right? These are contemporary texts, James Mill's and Tabatabai's. I think my methodological, or the methodological structure that I've inherited and have been taught, and I'm deploying it, is to actually go to these so-called originary texts. For the history of Pakistan, that's Chachnama. So I went and read it, and then I thought, okay, well, this makes no sense to what the story I've been told as a school child. And similarly, for the history of Hindustan, which was what this entire geographic expanse was known as, the entirety of it, again, from Kabul to Bengal, from Himalayas to Lanka, that was all Hindustan. That geography over the course of the 18th and 19th century begins to shrink and shrink and shrink until Sayyid Ahmed Khan, when he comes to Lahore to fund
गर तू बुरा न माने तेरे सनम कदों के बुत हो गए पुराने अपनों से बैर रखना तूने बुतों से सीखा जंगो जदल सिखाया वाइस को भी खुदा ने. He then elevates the focus from faith to the sacred nature of the homeland. पत्थर की मूर्तों में समझा है तू खुदा है खाके वतन का मुझको हर जर्रा देवता है. And then suggests the solution. आ मिल के गैरियत के पर्दों को फिर उठा दें, बिछड़ों को फिर मिला दें, नक्शे तुई मिटा दें. सुनी पड़ी हुई है मुद्दत से जी की बस्ती, आ एक नया शिवाला इस देश में बना दें. Let us now look a little closely in the way in which he talks about this issue. And do bear in mind the language that he uses. This is a Persian Urdu poet writing in British India. फिर एक अनूप ऐसी सोने की मूर्ति हो, अनूप इज यूनिक, इस हर दवारे दिल में लाकर जिसे बिठा दें. सुंदर हो उसकी सूरत, छब उसकी मोहिनी हो, इस देवता से मांगे जो दिल की हो मुरादें. जुन्नार हो गले में, तस्बीह हाथ में हो, यानी सनम कदे में शाने हरम दिखा दें. आंखों की है जो गंगा, ले ले के उससे पानी, इस देवता के आगे एक नहर सी बहा दें. And then he delivers the denouement. हिंदुस्तान लिख दें माथे पे इस सनम के, भूले हुए तराने दुनिया को फिर सुना दें. फिर का लफ्ज बहुत जरूरी है because he is anchoring his imagination to something that has already been there before and is in the process of being destroyed. अग्नि है वो जो निर्किन कहते हैं भी जिसको धर्मों के ये बखेड़े इस आग में जला दे. That is, so there we have it. Iqbal's reimagining of the subcontinent as Hindustan. Today, as we look at ourselves, it is my hope that the work of Manan and Asif and his colleagues will force us to re-examine our legacy in its syncretic richness. And if this engagement brings with it the painful sense of loss, I think it will also encourage us to do something about it. I would like to thank Manan for his time and for all of you being here. See you next year at the LLF.
Thank you so much.